John Pilджър has written dozens of books, including Heroes, which is one of my favorite books, Hidden Agendas, and Freedom Next Time. He's made over 60 documentaries, including Vietnam, The Quiet Mutiny, Year Zero, The Silent Death of Cambodia, The Secret Country, The First Australians Fight Back, The War You Don't See, The Coming War on China, and many more that we don't have time to list because he's so prolific. He's appeared as a contributor on BBC Television Australia, BBC Radio, BBC World Service, London Broadcasting, ABC Television, ABC Radio Australia, among others. And his writing has appeared at The Guardian, The Independent, New Statesman, The New York Times, The LA Times, and many more places. And you can find out more about him and find all his work at johnpilджър.com. So without any further ado, welcome, John Pilджъr.
Thank you, Katie. Very good to be on the show. Thanks for asking me.
Of course. Thank you so much for joining. And look, you have people in the audience saying in the chats that you make them proud to be an Australian or proud to be an Aussie. So I don't know if that's welcome or demoralizing thing to hear, but I'm assuming it's a good thing. So you are someone who I could ask so many questions to. We could talk about so many things, but I think that you and I had chatted a little bit and you thought it would be a good idea just to pull back the curtain, the fourth wall a little bit, and to start by talking about propaganda and how unrelenting it is. So I wanted to ask you how you define propaganda.
Well, propaganda, the term was first used in a prolific sense by Walter Lippmann and then Edward Bernays over 100 years ago. Interesting, Bernays, who was a super PR man during the First World War, was given the job of cleaning up the image of the First World War, a spectacularly difficult job. And that's when he invented the term public relations, because he realized that propaganda was a word that gave a bad name to war. It suggests you're not telling the truth. It suggests you're lying, and all this is very true. So the term public relations came out of that. That's always fascinating to me, because we accept PR, public relations, excuse me, as part of our usual discourse, that it's, I don't know about benign, but it's reasonably harmless. Perhaps it's about selling things we don't want, but
definitely normalized.
You don't have to be worried about. But in fact, it's quite a sinister term. It's propaganda. So propaganda got really underway then, and has never looked back.
And where do you think that the most dangerous propaganda can be found now?
Well, the most dangerous propaganda is coming out of the home of propaganda, and that's where you are in the United States. It's very dangerous because we now have something I've never known in my career, what could be called, I suppose, politely, a complete consensus in the mainstream on the current war going on in Europe. But it's a particularly important one, this, because it's really a proxy war between the United States and Russia. And that, of course, can lead to a catastrophe on a scale that we haven't known before. So that's where propaganda is most dangerous. But propaganda is dangerous every day in our lives when we're told, when we're persuaded to buy something, whether it's a consumer object that's not very good for us, or it's an idea that's very bad for us. That's propaganda. The news, I say these days, not only on Ukraine, but on most things, is propaganda. I find television news, which is still the primary source of most people's information in Western countries and many other places, I found it unwatchable because I have to sit there and either get angry or deconstruct it it doesn't inform me. So the idea of informing objectively, as objectively as one is able to, has gone almost completely.
And how do you, I've heard you use this term before, deconstructing the news. How does one do that? Because it seems very labor intensive.
Yeah, it's very hard. I mean, I think it's okay for the likes of me and you, because that's our business. Every day we're reading, we're finding out, we're navigating through the net. We're looking for facts and truth as best we can. Most people don't have the time to do that if they're doing other work, or as my mother used to say, they're doing a real job. And so it's not fair. It's just not fair on those people we are meant to serve. The whole notion of journalism as a public service of serving people has just gone. It's become a branch of public relations. But that's what real journalism is. And then that question would only arise in a very esoteric way. It's something people would be conscious of, that we have to serve. We have to give people as many of the facts about something as we possibly can, not some propaganda spin.
Right. I mean, you have to know so much. I mean, it's hard for me. You obviously, I'm not comparing myself to you because you're extremely prolific. But I enjoy doing media criticism, and even for me, it's incredibly labor intensive, because you need to know what you need to be looking at to disprove the other thing you're looking at. And that's totally overwhelming, especially, as you said, if people don't already have an orientation towards that, they won't even know that that's a thing to do. So that's probably one of the most frustrating things about media propaganda, is people not knowing it's propaganda, not having the tools to even realize that.
Yes, but Katie, it's very interesting the way people get it very quickly.
Right.
You know, I mean, that's no doubt why many people watch you and watch others, and because I think people are now so hungry for an alternative. You know, a correlation of this is that the reputation of journalists has nosedived. It's probably the lowest it's ever been, and rightly so. That's where mainstream journalism deserves to be. But that's left our audiences disorientated. What do they believe? The question faces thinking people. Other people, the news is just watching paint dry, you know. That's probably the best way to do it. But it's so much effort, so much official effort, so much power and resources are put into distorting the news by those who start wars, take over other countries, and wish to manipulate our whole sense of understanding, even our consciousness, that it has to be important. You know, it was General Pereas, the unlamented Pereas, who, when I think he was the general running the Afghanistan debacle, he spat it out in an interview and said that our most important people are the people at home, not the Taliban. Not worried about the Taliban. And what he was really saying, the subtext of this, is that our enemy are the people at home, because unless we can fool them, then we're not doing the job.
Right. I think he also let it slip that it was not in America's best interest to be involved in Israel the way we were. He may have had that as a moment of truth.
Oh, he did.
But not in a critical. I mean, I think he probably, I'm sure he regretted that. I'm sure he got chastised after doing that. And by the way, you mentioned your mother saying journalism isn't a real job.
Well, I went into journalism. I decided when I'd finished high school, and I decided that they then had here a very good, like an apprenticing cadetship, that I would join a newspaper and not go to university. Both my mother, who was a teacher, my father,
Elsie, right?
who was a working man, were both dismayed at this. And especially when I announced it was going to be journalism, my father then, he was ahead of the game, had a very healthy distrust of everything he read in newspapers. So there his son was heading into that, as it was once called, I think, I can't remember by whom, the Legion of Liars. He was quite upset. They got used to it pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And, I hope I put their minds at rest.
And you can read again more about John's parents, and I love the name Elsie, by the way. But you can read more about them at Heroes, which is such a great book, and it's in my bookshelf at my parents' when I used to tape my show up there. So, but then I was looking at it, I realized I'm covering the title, so I'm gonna have to move it and make it more visible so it doesn't just say HE basically. But what else? I mean, do you think that there's you brought up Ukraine, and it is somewhat unprecedented, this consensus around Ukraine that you see in places that, or I'm at least seeing in places where I usually find political agreement, even people who I agree with on other things. I find the world of people who see this as a proxy war, as opposed to seeing this as a Hitlerian march towards conquering the world, which we've actually seen that kind of ridiculous language. But I find that fewer people than I would think see it as a proxy war. And I feel like a lot of people I used to get along with and agree with politically are on that other side, where they see this as an unprovoked war, where they see this as reminiscent of World War II, and they don't want to stop the proxy war. Why do you think that is? Why is this an issue that is dividing people who sometimes or often see eye to eye?
Well, first of all, they're ignorant. And there's one way of curing ignorance, and that is to find out. And the wonderful thing today that somewhat counters the fact that we have such propaganda is that you can go through cyberspace and find real journalism. You can find real analysis, and you can find facts. It takes time, as we've discussed. I think one of the problems there, Katie, is that too often, and I think this is in the US more than anywhere, there is a kind of band of brothers and sisters, so-called, called the left. Well, there isn't. That's just not true. There are varying differences, radical differences, as there's always been. And for people to regard themselves as all belonging under one tent, so that they kind of have the same point of view and the same bigotry and the same ignorance, is slightly ridiculous. So I'm sure you're not worried about standing up to people like that from people who announce, and I'm always rather suspicious of people who keep declaring their political allegiance. Left, I'm left, you know, or John, I used to admire you.
Oh, yeah, that's another great one. What happened to you?
What happened to you? So, yeah, sure you did. But it's from the liberal, and that's a term that is so flexible, really elastic, but in the United States, it has a particular power. Perhaps it's called left liberal. It's from that source that so many of our problems have come. That doesn't mean to say that commentators like you and me are turning into terrible reactionaries. It's ridiculous. Right. We're not. Quite the opposite. But it means that the illusions created by liberalism, particularly American liberalism. When I went to live and work in the US.
And John, by the way, just so people know, is from Australia. And so when he's saying here, he's talking about Australia.
Yeah. Well, I was then, most of my career has been in the UK, where I've worked for British newspapers and television. And I was sent to the US in my early 20s, not long after I first arrived in England. The power of liberalism struck me, the power of its hypocrisies, the power of its kind of declared ownership of certain issues, and yet the power of its inaction, of leaving things be or actually opposing things. That's the kind of thing when I certainly get the same thing as you, as people on the so-called left say to you, how can you possibly be like that? You know, we are both of left. Well, no, we're not. Left actually is a noble expression. It shouldn't be misused.
Right. Yeah. It is. Yeah. I guess I expected more from certain people. And what I just find so surprising is that even after it's shown that the West has gotten the way of peace when it comes to Ukraine, you still have people saying, well, yeah, but there shouldn't be a negotiation yet. There shouldn't be diplomacy because that just empowers Putin.
Well, why allow people to be killed? Look, okay, you know, any invasion of a sovereign country is wrong. There's no question about that. And it's stated very clearly in the Nuremberg principles. But you know, the difference between the invasion of Ukraine and the invasion of Iraq was that one was entirely unprovoked and the other one was entirely provoked. And that is a huge but. That but has to be understood, because if you don't understand that but, then you deny yourself background and context to something. You deny yourself an understanding. The idea that we should all go around approving something. I don't approve of the invasion of Ukraine, but I'm determined to understand it. And it doesn't seem all that difficult to me to understand, because I've watched it over the last 20, 30 years, head that way, head towards the western borders of Russia. There's no question about that. That was the aim, was to break up the Russian Federation. It was the aim in 1919, after the revolution, was to destroy the Soviet Union. The denial of history, the denial that the Red Army played the pivotal role in winning the Second World War, are all part of this. Now, you go much deeper when if we try to examine why do we have this thing about Russia? Well, it's multifaceted. It does have to do with a kind of, I suppose, economic, except, you know, Russia today is a capitalist country, pretty much. It's about, in many ways, it's about the other. It's about Eurasia. They're not quite us. They come from a different, many of them come from a different part of the planet, those strange people on the steppes that came down. Who are they? And it's also ridiculous, because they could be asking the same of us. You know, you're speaking from an immigrant country, and so am I. And it's the And the same can be applied, I find, to China, the willful ignorance of China, of understanding the changes that have gone on to China. Just even saying that in sections of social media qualifies you to be called an apologist for the Chinese Communist Party. It's just absurd.